Hi, folks, and welcome to I'm All Over the Place. This is Dara Star Tucker. I am looking forward to presenting this conversation with you with one of my favorite political commentators. His name is Jamelle Bouie. You may be familiar with him. If you are not, I would highly encourage you to look him up as soon as possible. Jamelle is a writer for the New York Times. He is a commentator with CBS. He formerly has written for Slate Magazine and for The Daily Beast. He's one of my favorite TikTokers. We are mutuals over there, and that's how we connected. So I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. I want to remind you all that I will be at Blues Alley in Washington, D.C. on the 22nd of March. If you have not picked up your tickets, I would encourage you to do that as soon as possible. That is a Friday night. I'll be doing two shows there, one at 7 o'clock and one at 9 o'clock. So you can get your tickets at bluesalley.com. And I want to say for our YouTube audience, the ones who watched the video version of these conversations, for the first 10 minutes, there will not be video. I forgot to run the actual video recording for the first 10 minutes, so you're only going to hear audio. But then after about 10 minutes, you will see the video kick in. So I do apologize for that. For the audience who's listening in podcast form, it's not going to make one smack of difference for you. Now, for this episode specifically, you are going to get quite a different version than what the KJLH audience heard. As you've probably heard me say in the past, I have a radio show for KJLH. I'm sharing a lot of those episodes with you here on I'm All Over the Place, but I've got to keep those episodes to 25 minutes exactly, and I cannot go over that. So the really cool thing about being able to share this with my podcast audience is that I don't have to edit the episodes down here. I can leave them fully intact. And with this episode specifically, the interview was about 40 minutes long. So you all are going to be hearing quite a bit more of the conversation between Jamelle Bouie and myself than the radio audience did. What the KJLH audience is going to hear is probably about 17 minutes of our conversation, where you all are getting close to 40 minutes of this conversation. So a completely different show. I'm really glad to be able to share this full conversation with you because Jamelle, as you're going to hear, he's super knowledgeable about presidential history and so many things that wouldn't necessarily be right for a radio interview. But I relish the opportunity to be able to share this with my podcasting audience. So settle in, prepare yourselves to be educated and informed by the wonderful Mr. Jamelle Bouie. Here's the conversation. Well, hello, folks, and welcome to The Breakdown. My name is Dara Star Tucker, and I'm so happy to be joined today by Mr. Jamelle Bouie. He is a reporter for the New York Times, has worked for Slate Magazine, and is a commentator with CBS News and many other organizations. Jamelle Bouie is one of the most informed and knowledgeable people out there talking about politics and culture today. And I'm just so honored that he would take this time to have a conversation with us. Jamelle and I connected through TikTok. We are mutuals over on TikTok, and he does a lot of commentary over there, just helping people like me who are not experts to get our heads around politics, just the whole landscape and how that relates to race and to culture. He has a unique point of view, and I'm just so happy to have him on today. Thank you so much for being with us, Jamelle.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I'm so glad to have you here because you're speaking from a point of view these days that is super necessary. I think it was on your website where you had a tagline or something to that effect, talking about politics and contextualizing it with history. So would you say that that is your kind of focus, that is your passion to contextualize modern day politics historically?
Yeah, I think that's the main thing I'm trying to do. I have a long-standing interest in American history, also like social science, but mostly American history. And with my column at the Times, I really focus on trying to place contemporary events in sort of a larger historical context and really asking people to focus on what I would describe as sort of like the structural and institutional realities of American politics. I often find that people become frustrated by what they witness. And this is not to excuse the actions of individuals, but to say that like everything is happening within sort of like a context, historically, structurally, institutionally, that is important to understand if you want to change the outcomes. If you don't understand that context, then not only do the outcomes seem nonsensical, but then sort of the path to changing them becomes like much harder to see.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm noticing a lot, particularly with kind of the younger generation. There's a lot of kind of lefties on TikTok and progressive thinkers. I'm just noticing a lot of the questioning and some of the despondency, I would say, around the whole concept of just democracy, period. Just, are we able to affect change? Does what we do matter? Does voting matter? Does being involved in the political process matter? And some of that despondency, if I'm honest, it's concerning to me as someone who was raised, I mean, fairly, I wouldn't say necessarily we weren't like flag waving people, but I was raised to believe in the basic concept of democracy, and that we're kind of all headed in a direction that we hopefully can be proud of, and we're in the boat rowing together. That's the goal, at least, that we would be steering the ship in a particular direction. And I'm starting to notice a lot of younger people sort of throwing up their hands and saying, well, none of, what does it matter? What does any of it matter? We're not really in a democracy, and this is all for naught. And so addressing, a lot of those attitudes of cynicism, I don't know, is it a passion for you? I mean, how are you feeling about how the younger generation is getting their heads wrapped around, this whole democratic process?
Yeah, I very much understand the cynicism, and I don't necessarily think it's unwarranted. But I think the thing that troubles me is the extent to which that cynicism can like bleed into like a real nihilism about just politics and about sort of political life. I think, okay, as I try to diagnose what I think is going on, I think that there is a kind of belief, from where it comes, I have no idea, that because you are in, if you feel that you are in the right, that you are correct, therefore political forces must like bend to you or recognize the fact that you're correct and act accordingly. And I think the thing that's difficult to understand and difficult to accept, not even understand, difficult to accept, is that kind of politics has really little to do with who's right and who's wrong. That sounds crazy, right? Like it sounds frankly incredibly cynical, but I think it's just sort of a recognition of how things play out, that like politics isn't actually not about determining who is substantively correct and who is substantively wrong, who is morally correct and who's morally wrong. It's just like the allocation of power. That's what politics is. It's how do we allocate power as a society. And people who are wrong, substantively or morally, are so perfectly capable of finding ways to allocate power to themselves and acting accordingly. And the process of getting power for yourself is largely divorced from whether you're right or wrong about the thing you care about. And so I find myself trying to urge people to think more about the political process and think more about politics, like in terms of the allocation of power, like kind of just getting people to sort of dump their minds of the idea that your rightness really has anything to do with whether you're able to get the outcomes you want. It simply doesn't. And so I think once you kind of relieve yourself of that idea, and begin to think more strategically about like what actually is politics and what you're trying to accomplish, I actually think the outlook becomes less depressing in a funny way. If you view it all as just like a lot of machinery and like how do you master the machinery, I think that provides pathways to action and grounds for taking action in a way that kind of like frustration at being right but not seeing that recognized does not. Like if you know you're right, and I think many young people are quite right about many of the things that they're upset about and many of the things that they care about. You're right, but you don't see the political system reacting or responding to the fact that you're right. That's sort of like, oh, okay, what's the point? But if you're like, well, it isn't whether I'm right, but like how much power can I bring to bear? Like what kind of influence do I actually have within the political process? Like, can I put pressure on political leaders? If you begin looking at it in those terms, then there really are like steps you can take. There's like a path you can take to accumulating power such that you can actually act on the things that you believe that you are right about. The other thing kind of related to this that I think is really hard to fully internalize is that there is simply not going to, in the kind of society we have, there's simply not ever going to be a world in which even when you have power, you get to disregard the people who think you are wrong and disregard the people who disagree with you. Even the people who you think have the most heinous views imaginable still get representation and still are entitled to representation and still can exercise power. And it's sort of like they aren't just obstacles you can bowl over. They are obstacles you have to find some way to like negotiate with. And there's just sort of there's no getting around that. And that's, I think, like really difficult for people to internalize, because it sort of implies, right, that like there's never going to be a point where you can simply say, okay, we won. That's like never going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you kind of specifically, I guess, about Black voters in this election and where we fit. I don't really feel like we've been at the forefront of a lot of conversations that are happening around the 2024 election and issues that matter to Black voters. Not that issues like Social Security or the environment or, student loan forgiveness don't matter to Black voters. But in terms of the Biden administration or the potential Trump administration's ability to address issues that specifically relate to the Black community, that where do those issues fit in this election? Will they be at the foreground? Will issues that address poverty, I mean, I hate to immediately relate that issue to the Black community, but will the issues that specifically relate to the Black community, will they factor at all in this election? Or is this really more of a referendum on democracy and where it sits, and the big ticket issues like Social Security and the economy and all the issues that govern pretty much every election? I remember the Cornel West and Tavis Smiley kind of had a campaign going against Barack Obama for his lack of prioritization of those issues that relate to the working class in this country. And I don't know that I necessarily see anyone kind of championing those causes right now. So do Black voters have a voice in this election?
It's interesting. When I think about issues that matter to the Black community, I sort of think about them in kind of like two buckets, right? There's I think the stuff that broadly speaking, the public associates with Black voters, like criminal justice reform and voting rights and civil rights and those things, which are important. And I'm not sure that they're going to play that much of a role in this election as sort of like big topics of discussion, only in as much as there may be, right, like intra-community debate over, who has been more favorable to the Black community writ large, or Black communities across the country with regards to that stuff. But then there's like this other bucket of stuff, which I think people have a tendency to think of just sort of like general political topics like the economy, but I actually think should be considered like very specifically, in the context of the Black community. Like, for example, historically, Black unemployment is usually around twice that of white unemployment. Like, it's a persistent feature of the American economy going back basically as far as we have metrics for it. Historically, wage growth has been slower for Black Americans, and also wages overall are lower than for white Americans. And of course, there's the racial wealth gap, but like to an extent, the racial wealth gap is like a function of these other things happening in the economy. I think that dynamic may very well be part of this election, because I think this election is going to be very much a choice election. Sort of, do you feel better off over the last 4 years? Or did you feel better off under Trump, basically? And here's where I'm going to editorialize a little bit. There is going to be like a real effort to argue that like Black Americans were better off under Trump. But the numbers suggest, right, sort of in the aggregate, that like, no, there's been the unemployment gap between Black Americans and white Americans has like shrunk dramatically over the last few years. That's in large part because the White House and the Federal Reserve have been kind of pursuing what's called full employment policies. The idea being that there are more jobs available than workers that can fill them. And so when you have more jobs available than workers that can fill them, employers become kind of desperate for workers, desperate to find people, willing to sort of like hire outside of where they normally would be, willing to raise wages to attract new workers, willing to educate people they already have on their payroll, rather than trying to sort of lots more promotions, that kind of thing. And those sorts of policies are hugely beneficial for Black Americans. They just are. By kind of raising demand for labor so high, employers become like much more willing to hire lots of people, and that especially includes Black Americans. So what we've seen over the last few years is the Black-white unemployment gap has shrunk, wage gains for Black Americans have accelerated, and the gap in wage growth for Blacks and whites has declined. The racial wealth gap has declined somewhat. Again, that's like very much a function of like these other things. But I think this is going to be like a stage of debate for this election, sort of who has been better for Black Americans. I think because the what's called the First Step Act was signed into law under Trump, there's going to be like a real effort to argue like Trump helped get Black Americans out of jail. I think that is quite overstated in terms of the effect of that law, as well as the fact that like many Republicans oppose it, right? And so like there's quite a few Republicans who want to repeal that law, which is a thing to keep in mind, that like when you elect a president, you're not just electing the guy, you're electing sort of like an entire coalition of people, and the Trump coalition, oddly enough, contains people who do not like this one thing that Trump signed. And then under Biden, there has been real efforts to decriminalize marijuana, to kind of reduce the population of people imprisoned in federal jails, federal prisons. There's been like real efforts at criminal justice reform that have not been as flashy as a piece of legislation, but do represent kind of like real efforts to respond to the needs of people within the Democratic Party coalition. But again, I'm not actually sure how much the election's going to be like dueling narratives along those issues. I think a lot of it's going to be around economic issues. I think, another issue that I don't think people associate with the Black community, but is very relevant to Black Americans, is like reproductive freedom and reproductive justice. Black women are of course, have much higher rates of maternal mortality than white women do, than women of any other race in the country. I think other than Native American women. Black children have like higher rates of infant mortality, and all of this is tied up in like the availability of reproductive health services. Like if your state bans abortion, it's not just like that there's no abortion, it's that the whole host of reproductive health services are less available, right? And there are already stories of OBGYNs leaving anti-abortion states and like depriving whole regions of the country of decent reproductive health care. And so I think that will be an area that's going to be a place where the election is contested, and it is very relevant to Black Americans as well. So yeah, I feel like I have maybe sort of like a somewhat different view of how to understand issues that are important to Black Americans, and that is like I think lots of things that people don't associate with us, they should, because the direction is like really important to our flourishing and our direction in this country. I have like, especially in reproductive, I have like a lot to say about reproductive freedom, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in that issue and have been doing some content around it myself and plan to do more of that in the future. You mentioned the word narrative, and that caught my ear because that is obviously a way that Trump himself is. I mean, that's his bag anyway. That's his shtick anyway. It's creating the narrative. He's a personality candidate, I guess you would say, and a lot of people that get on board with Trumpism and Trump himself aren't necessarily policy wonks. They are people who are looking for a magnetic personality or a sympathetic personality, or someone that they can personally identify with. That's one commonality that I think we see in a lot of Trump voters. They're just like, this is my guy. This is the guy that I feel represents who I am in the world. He's blustering. He's a wealthy guy. He's confident. He's kind of a loudmouth, and he's just, kind of quintessentially American, really.
Yeah.
And so for Black voters, we're noticing there was a report that came out a while back about that showed a bunch of AI images, artificially generated images of a bunch of young voters kind of hanging out with Trump. And, I don't know who those images were created by. I'm not necessarily saying they came out of the Trump campaign, but someone created some images that showed young Black people kind of gathered around Trump, and just these, it obviously is very important to him personally to feel that he has the ability to connect with at least a certain segment of the Black population. And he did a speech a couple of weeks ago at a gathering of Black Republicans in South Carolina, where he made a bunch of statements about, well, the fact that I'm under indictment, this is one reason that the Black community will identify more deeply with me. And he's made statements like that in the past.
Right.
And, Fox News reporters and other conservative commentators, have made comments about, well, the mugshot, and that's just really going to energize the Black community because they're going to, they're going to see him as an OG. He's going to be, and even the sneakers coming out. And it's like, well, if they're going to spend $400 on sneakers, well, imagine, how excited they're going to be about their guy Trump, And so this idea that the criminalization, I guess, of Trump makes him more identifiable or empathetic, that Black people will have more empathy with him because of these factors. I mean, is this obviously you being an educated person, and me and many of the listeners being educated people, and myself, not coming from any kind of a criminal background, that's hugely and highly insulting to me personally as a Black person. Is this something that you see that holds a high level of offense in the Black community? Do most Black people have just an immediate negative reaction to the idea that Black people would identify more with Trump based on factors like that? Is that as deeply offensive to most Black people as it feels to me?
I mean, it's offensive to me. I imagine to be like offensive to my parents and my brother and like lots of other people I know in everyday life. But the thing about Trump's appeal that I think actually gets it's under notice or it gets short shrift is that he has it's like this blustering masculinity. He has all this money. He has, he's had many wives. He has this appears to live this life of luxury. He's dismissive of authority. It's sort of in a lot of ways like a hyper masculine power fantasy that I think that there are many men for whom that appeals. And so even within the Black community, I think that kind of language, it certainly turns many people off, but I still think it's important not to understate the extent to which there'll be some Black men, I think, not necessarily younger, but like just, some Black men who are going to remain attracted to that masculine power fantasy that I think Trump represents. And I'm not sure, for one, I'm not sure how one pushes back against that, in part because I think part of what attracts those men to Trump is the desire to not be associated with anything that even smacks of femininity. And so a message or a narrative that focuses on, doing best to sort of care for the entire community is in fact like the opposite thing you want to say. Because it's sort of like, well, I don't care about caring for the entire community. I want someone who's going to affirm me as a man in the way that I think is appropriate. And also kind of, I want this kind of masculine imagery to aspire to.
So is it working? I mean, he says he's up at 20. I haven't really looked at poll numbers, I have to be honest. He says he's up at somewhere around 25% approval with Black voters. I mean, does this approach seem to be working for him?
Right. So it's tough to kind of figure out whether it's working at all, in part because there has not been, as far as I know, like a singular survey of Black Americans specifically, meaning trying to get a broad representative sample of Black Americans to kind of figure out what they think about Trump right now in this moment. What there have been are standard issue, high quality national surveys that may get a small subsample of black voters. Maybe out of 1,000 respondents to the survey or to the phone calls, you're getting 20 black people. And then what the pollsters are going to do is they're going to say, we're going to try to weight, we're going to use various like statistical weights to try to make sure that get as close as we can to something that maybe represents what all black Americans think, or at least in the context of this larger sample, accurately represents kind of the weight black Americans would have in a proper statistical sample. But one effect of these small samples of black Americans in these national polls is that if you have like one or two idiosyncratic people in the group, then even with all the weighting, you're going to get kind of insane results, right? So you'll get a result that says, oh, 30% of black Americans say they support Trump. And it's like that would be genuinely striking. That's like a genuinely striking result that probably isn't going to bear itself out in voting. If you look at kind of voting among black Americans since basically 1992, the Democratic share of the vote, the low ebb is something like 86%. The highest point, the highest vote share Democrats have gotten among black Americans, I think was in 2008, where it was like 98% of black Americans who voted for Obama, like something insane. And so I don't know if it's working. I think to the extent that Democrats have a problem, it's less big defections to Trump, more people just don't turn out, people just don't show up to vote. I'm quite skeptical that Trump is attracting like anything past 12 or 13% of all black voters total. Like I would be very surprised at that.
Yeah. Do you feel like Biden is doing enough, I guess, to counter that messaging? Is Biden doing a good enough job at getting out any sort of messaging to the black community specifically? How is he doing? Yeah.
How is he doing? So it's clear at this moment that Biden is just like is having a difficult time communicating really like anything to the broad public about what his administration is doing. That probably is going to be changing quite soon. The State of the Union was on March 7th. That was very much like that was a very combative, you might even say like quite partisan speech he gave. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that kind of thing going forward. Whether he can persuade voters and black voters in particular that his administration has been working for them, I think is an open question. I think the tough thing is that, and this is where go back to Trump, the First Step Act is like a really valuable thing to have in his pocket. It is hard to sell, look, good economic management has been hugely beneficial to the black community, which it has. It's just simply a fact. Like, it is immensely important that the black-white unemployment gap has shrunk, because that just does not mean that more black Americans have jobs. It means, and among other things, more stable families, more stable communities, and by bringing more people into the labor force, more people having jobs, people working, more people having work background, it sets them up for success in the future. Kind of like unemployment is horrible in part because it can create cycles of disadvantage over time, because once you kind of get stuck in unemployment, it's very difficult to get out of it on a macro level. And so it's like really important that the administration has presided over like really low unemployment for black Americans and like meaningfully increased wage growth in the aggregate for black Americans. But like there's no piece of legislation you can point to, right? There's no bill that's like lower black unemployment bill of 2023 that you can say we passed that. And so it's like it's a little harder to make that case versus you can say, well, we passed this bill called the First Step Act and it does X, Y, or Z. And so that looks like it's doing more, even if you take the broad picture, setting aside, I mean, economic management under Trump was like fine. It was not particularly good, wasn't particularly bad. But then the pandemic like disproportionately hurt black communities in a huge way in terms of deaths, in terms of unemployment, in terms of like everything bad about the pandemic landed with much more force on black Americans. And the former president like grossly mismanaged the pandemic. Like that is the thing that happened. But that's, again, hard case to make, because in addition to not being able to point to a specific piece of legislation that does a specific thing, people also don't like to hear those kinds of comparisons, even if they're true. They do want to hear, what are you doing for me now? Can Biden do that? On the one hand, I'm saying it's hard. On the other hand, this will be his fourth national election, and thus far his win record for national elections is 3 wins, 0 losses. So Biden's been, 2008, 2012, 2020, 3 national elections, 2 as VP, 1 as top of the ticket, and he's been on the winning side on all 3. That's an impressive record. That's actually one of the better records in American political history. You'll be hard pressed to begin to find politicians on either side who can claim that kind of win-loss record in a national election, right? Like Richard Nixon, who was vice president for Eisenhower, 52 and 56, so he got 2 wins, loses in 1960, so he has his loss, and he wins again in 68, and he wins again in 72. So 5 national elections, 4 wins, 1 loss. And coming back after the loss is quite unusual. So that's all to say. I'm here saying I don't know if Biden can do it, but he has 2 wins under Reagan with Reagan, and then, or 3 wins, and then he lost re-election. So that's where Biden is right now. It's sort of is he going to win re-election? And we'll see.
Well, I appreciated your video. I was going to do a similar video to one that you did, where people, and I still may, where people attempt to prognosticate about what the outcome of the election will be. And I'm sure people have their reasons for wanting to do that. But I appreciated you coming out and just saying, look, no one knows at this point what the outcome will be. And anyone who claims that they do is just blowing smoke, because it's really an unknown right now.
It's a very weird election year. I mean, it's just to do a little more political history. So we have an incumbent president, Joe Biden, who's previously vice president, up against a former incumbent president who is also a felon, also under criminal investigation, also tried to overturn the last election, which is a big deal as well. And just even if you take away the whole criminal element, the last time you had an incumbent against a former incumbent was 1912. And even that's a little weird, because it's Woodrow Wilson up against the incumbent, William Howard Taft, up against a third party candidate who is also a former incumbent, Teddy Roosevelt. So there's a 3-way race. The last time you have this exact scenario, incumbent up against predecessor who is an incumbent, with no third party in the race, I believe is the 1888 election between Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland. Benjamin Harrison had beaten Grover Cleveland, and then Grover Cleveland comes back to beat Benjamin Harrison. But we have one example of this happening, of this kind of election. And so my whole thinking is the models, how political scientists have modeled elections, usually it's either an incumbent up against a challenger, or an open seat with one candidate representing the former incumbent and another candidate representing the opposition. And there's particular dynamics that go with those sorts of scenarios. But this particular scenario where 2 candidates, everyone knows who they are, right? No one does not know who Joe Biden and Donald Trump are. Most of the electorate will have already cast a ballot in this matchup. So yeah, it's weird. And so trying to make a prediction, I find unhelpful, because it's already difficult to model an electorate, already difficult to make predictions when it's sort of a normal election. I remember the 2012 presidential election, people were making predictions all kind of ways, and many of them were quite wrong. It was a very normal election. My own view here is to urge a little humility about what we can know about this year, because I think it's going to prove to be a very weird year in American politics.
Yeah. Which is it's just disappointing to me to think that it could be back in this position, that this could be anywhere near just close. I cannot get my head around where we are in American politics right now. It makes absolutely no sense to me, but which makes the work that you are doing so important. I do have one final question I want to ask you. I did a ridiculous video recently that I did not expect to go viral, something about ships and cruises and dead bodies and ridiculous.
Yeah, I noticed that
It just is downright angering. But when I put so much work into videos that are truly informative and well researched and edited, actually wearing makeup and, it just, I don't know. It's just that situation completely angered me. But, and then after that, I reposted a couple of videos that I had done on the Voting Rights Act. And they got almost no views. I mean, they didn't even get 10,000 views each. And it was really just sad and discouraging and so just disappointing for me to see that, man, people would click on this ridiculous, cruise ship ice cream party death video where I was really just repeating secondhand information, which I typically would never do. But that's the thing that popped off. That's the thing that people wanted to see. It got picked up by every Rupert Murdoch publication, really in the Western world. It was just utterly ridiculous. But the videos on voting rights did almost nothing. And so my question for you is the Voting Rights Act still needed? Is this something we should still be talking about? I feel like we're not talking about it. And when we talk about issues that affect Black Americans, which you did mention earlier at the start of the program, when I mentioned the issues that are important to us, and voting rights being one of those issues, I feel like that issue in and of itself has kind of just fallen off the map as an important issue that we talk about because we are, we'd like to think of ourselves as almost being a post-racial society, though we know that we're not. But when I really got in and studied kind of the bones of that bill, it just there's so much there. There's so much that's needed, in my opinion. And why aren't we talking about the Voting Rights Act? And is this something that should be taking center stage?
This is an issue where. So first, I think it should be taking center stage. I think the sad fact is that the Supreme Court over the last decade has steadily eroded the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, with Shelby County v. Holder, it more or less killed the most important part of the Voting Act, which was Section 5, which held that in specified jurisdictions, if the jurisdiction wants to change its voting laws, it has to pre-clear it with the federal government. The Supreme Court, in a truly terrible opinion, the 5-4 majority of the court struck that down. More recently, there is a case going after. So right now, under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, anyone can file a lawsuit under Section 2 if you feel that you have been discriminated against in voting as a private citizen. You can go file suit against your locality, your city, your state, in federal court. Got a private right of action. And there's a case right now challenging the existence of a private right of action under Section 2, which would mean that if the Supreme Court were to rule that there is no private right of action under Section 2, then the only entity that could file lawsuits under Section 2 would be the federal government, which there's first of all, even in the best case scenario, right? Like a presidential administration strongly committed to the Voting Rights Act with a well-funded, well-staffed, experienced civil rights division of the Justice Department. There's no way, even there, you'd have enough resources to file and fight every case that might come up. You'd have to do investigations. It's like a whole thing, right? But then you have to remember, right, not every administration is going to be strongly supportive of civil rights. Not every administration is going to be strongly supportive of voting rights. Not every civil rights division is going to be stocked with people who care about that stuff. Under George W. Bush, for example, the civil rights division was, I believe, not led, but was a major figure within it was a guy who was actively hostile to expansive voting rights legislation. So losing a private right of action under Section 2 would be kind of disastrous for a lot of the strategies that have emerged in the 50 years since the Voting Rights Act, 59 years since the Voting Rights Act, to advance and protect people's voting rights. there was a case last year in Alabama, which almost, the Supreme Court ends up rejecting out the state of Alabama's claim. But what the state of Alabama was trying to do was invalidate basically the part of the Voting Rights Act which mandates that, Black Americans, other racial minorities should be able to choose. Their vote cannot be diluted in gerrymandering. What Alabama was trying to do was prevent Black Alabamans from getting 2 seats in their federal representation. And they drew a map to kind of like break up the concentration of Black voters and kind of dilute them so that wouldn't be possible. And the Voting Rights Act says that's illegal, but they want to challenge that. This is all to say, Voting Rights Act under threat, and the president mentioned it in the State of the Union, the John Lewis bill. I imagine there'll be talk of voting rights in the fall, but I think the most important thing to think about here is that so much of the battle is going to be taking place in the courts, taking place at the level of the Supreme Court. Frankly, if Donald Trump is in office next year, virtual guarantee that Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas will retire in the next 4 years, and they'll get replaced by people even more extreme than they are. And that will be the Supreme Court for basically the rest of our lives. If Biden is in office for the next 4 years, no guarantee that those two retire, but they're old and in poor health. So over the next 4 years, there's a real chance of, at the very least, 1 or 2 justices being replaced. And if you keep 3 liberal justices and add 2 more, have a 5-4 liberal court, that saves the Voting Rights Act. It saves the Civil Rights Act, which there is a mounting effort to begin to dismantle that as well. So I think people should take very seriously the threats to landmark civil rights legislation. We're already seeing it, be taken apart piecemeal in quiet ways. But I think under a second Trump administration, it would be a full-blown assault on what's left of that legislation. All under the guise of fairness and colorblindness, right? Sort of, we're just trying to be fair, but really an effort to dismantle federal protection of civil and voting rights in its entirety, leaving Americans and Black Americans in particular to the mercies of states which, even now in 2024, there are plenty of state legislatures that have no interest in making it easier for Black people to vote.
Well, there's so much at stake, and it's a lot to get our heads around. And so that's one of the reasons that I feel like we should be having conversations like this early out, many, many months removed from the election, because I feel like a lot of us we wait until 2 weeks before the election to start trying to get our heads in the game and start thinking about the issues on any kind of a deep level. So I really appreciate you taking time to talk this through with us. And I would like to invite you to be on again, hopefully in a couple months, a few months, to kind of catch up with what's important, what we should be thinking about, maybe focus on some different issues than what we did today. And just kind of getting this information piecemeal, I think is the best way for us to not feel overwhelmed when November comes, because obviously we haven't even talked about the congressional elections and senatorial elections that
Right.
are happening at the same time. This is not really all just about presidential elections. There's a lot at stake. So the work you do is really important, Jamelle. And so I just want to thank you for doing that work, period. And then for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us, because it's so needed. And I hope we can do this again multiple times this year, I'm hoping.
Yeah, I see no reason why not.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This is Dara Star Tucker. Thank you all so much for joining me for this episode of The Breakdown. You can find me at Radio Free KJLH on Instagram and at Dara Star Tucker on Instagram. Jamelle, please tell us where you can find where we can find you.
You can find me at the New York Times. I'm a columnist. My column runs most Tuesdays and Fridays. And then I am on TikTok these days. That's like my social media these days, TikTok. So I'm at Jamelle Bouie on TikTok. I think my handle is B-Boy Bouie Bays, which is a play on a song that I really like. I've never been a B-boy in my life.
Can you spell your name for us?
Sure thing. JamellBouie.
Okay, Jamelle Bouie. Please seek out Jamelle Bouie. If anything, you'll find maybe 5 minutes here and there just to get a little soundbite, a little snippet, or maybe be able to read something that he's written that just helps you to be just a little bit more informed. I know it's sometimes hard and it can feel overwhelming, but listening to voices like Jamelle can help you to get your head around the issues on a much deeper level. And he's just such a thoughtful person and so well informed. I'm so glad I found your content, and you've helped me already. I feel like a smarter person just from listening to you, Jamelle. So
no, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.